You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Talk of the Thames. I'm your host, Chloe Russell. Today's episode is a little different to usual. I hope you don't mind. We get the joy of using our imagination in the next 30 minutes. We're going on a guided walk along the Greenwich Peninsula, home to a certain O2 arena that you may or may not have heard of before. We plan on taking you along the Thames path. Joining us and teaching us are our very own Thames Estuary Partnership Data and Training Manager, Wanda Bodnar, and our Technical Director, Amy Pryor. So there's lots of exciting features to look forward to in the next 30 minutes, including some Thames foreshore soundscapes, and a few short questions to some of the guests that joined us on the walk. This guided walk was part of the Totally Thames Festival. Totally Thames Festival has been on for the past month, and it's had some real highlights. There has been unique and diverse art and culture exhibitions, activities, and events that took place on, beneath, or just along the River Thames. Be sure to check out the link in this episode's show notes to see all the wonderful things that have been happening this last month. Now let's get straight into our guided walk. Wherever you are right now, if it's on the commute or sat at home enjoying a cuppa, allow yourself to relax and perhaps even close your eyes. Now it's a beautiful sunny Saturday morning. The sky is blue and there's a chill in the air. The wind has picked up and you can feel the chill when you roam around in the shadows. Now as a group we're sat together on the Thames path, opposite the Emirates airline, with the River Thames stretched in front of us from left to right, as far as the eyes can reach. We start our walk with Wanda, introducing the River Thames. Enjoy.
So first of all, when it comes to the River Thames, we need to distinguish between the River Thames as a whole, which is 346 kilometers long, starting at Gloucestershire at Thames Head, and it's a series of springs really that coming out of the ground, and that's the source of the Thames. Interestingly, this year, because of the heat wave that we had, the source of the Thames went further down about 5 miles. So the actual source sort of dried up, which was the first time in recorded history that it happened. And so basically, and then there's the section which is, because it's connected to the North Sea, it's influenced by the tide. So that's the section that we refer to the tidal Thames or the Thames Estuary or tideway. You might be hearing this as well. So basically the tide comes in and ebbs out roughly every 6 hours. So we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a day. The range can be up to 7 meters. If it's spring tide, then it goes up to 7 meters. And what's actually quite interesting that the geography of south-east England is that the Thames is actually gently sloping towards the North Sea. So that's why we have this sort of rocking motion. So the flood tide, so the high tide will come in for about 13 kilometers. And the low tide or the ebb tide will go out for about 15 kilometers. So it has this sort of motion. So from the perspective of pollution, etc., that's a bit of a trap because whatever we put there is going to remain in the estuary for about 3 months. And obviously the tide will depend how it changes, the spring tide, the neap tide, etc., in terms of how the moon, the sun, and the earth aligns. So this is just a topographic map showing the difference. So it's about 100 meters different between the Thames Head and actually the North Sea. So that's 100 meters in terms of elevation. And then actually the actual tidal limit, so where we refer to the Thames, the tidal Thames or the Thames Estuary, is at Teddington, so within the Greater London area. And because because of this constant movement of water, we can distinguish between zones. So we have freshwater zone up to between the whole of the upstream section down to roughly Battersea, and then between Battersea and actually Greenwich, it's brackish, so it's a mix of fresh and salty water, and then this section all the way out to the North Sea is salty water. So, but these zones will always change. So depending on how much of the fresh water is coming down, or how much the tide is actually intruding. So when it's really dry weather, we will get more salty, and when it's a lot of rain, then we will have fresh water further down. In terms of, just to show you what lives in the Thames, so we have this sort of map put together recently, and I can give everyone one of these. So you can see these are some of the species that you will find in the Thames. Thank you. These are just some of the species, as I said. So actually there's roughly 115 different species of fish that we can find in the Thames Estuary. These are about 40 of them, including the 3 species of sharks and the 2 species of seals. This year we have done some fish surveys, and I can tell you that the prevailing species that we found was the sea bass, the common goby, and we found a couple of dace as well, flounder for sure, and then occasionally we also find the eels as well, which are quite interesting. On the bottom of this, you can see that we distinguish between the freshwater, brackish, marine, etc. So we categorize those fish in terms of where they live. So you have to imagine that as the tide moves, these species of fish will move accordingly as well. And in terms of the sharks, have you heard about the sharks living in the Thames Estuary? Yes? No? Maybe? So there are 3 species of sharks, basically. They are not the ones who will come and bite your leg off. They actually staying further out in the outer estuary, and they tend to be mostly bottom feeders. And then they go after small fish and small invertebrates. And the grey seal and the harbour seal are also interesting. So they're obviously air breeders, but they go after the fish, and they tend to go all the way up to Teddington. You can see them sometimes. I paddleboard further upstream, and 2020 was quite busy seal-wise because there was not much traffic, and obviously the seals were having a good time. So we encountered in that year quite a few of them. In terms of the harbour seal, the way to distinguish them, that the harbour seal has more of a cat-shaped face, and the grey seal has more of a dog-shaped one. The grey seals are also bigger, and the grey seals tend to be further out in the estuary and also roaming around the North Sea during the summer season. The harbour seals are the other way around. So we tend to see more harbour seals within the central section, definitely during the summer period. Canary Wharf actually is a very good seal spotting area because of all the high-rise buildings. And the reason why seals will come ashore and just chill out there is that they either in their breeding period or during the summer period they lose their fur. So they need to be out of the water more often, otherwise they would get cold. So they're just chilling there. So if you ever have the chance to meet with the seal, keep your distance, take your picture, move on. Because the problem can be that if they see you, that means that you already disturbed them. But it's a really good thing that they are here, and actually their population is quite stable as well.
And we're back in the room. It's so great to hear that the seal population is stable. Have you ever seen a seal in the Thames? I haven't, but believe you me, I do have my eyes peeled. Next, we have a Vox Pop question where we ask our guests what word springs to mind when you think of the River Thames.
History. Joy. Tidal. Long.
Wasn't that fun? The soundscapes you hear are my footsteps walking towards the foreshore of the Thames. Next, we have Amy talking to us about estuary edges. I hope you enjoy.
Right, so estuary edges. What on earth do we mean by that? So as Wanda was saying, this is one big system. It's a tidal river connected to the global ocean. And when the city wasn't here, this would have all been salt marsh and marshland. So where we're standing right now is what would have been the natural floodplain of the tidal estuary. The river's actually a third of the width of what it would have been in Roman times. So imagine that, where we're standing, it would have been 3 times wider. It would have been shallower. This would have all been marshland, and there would have been what they call a braided system across that floodplain. So as all natural rivers, if they're not constrained by human activity, they wander across the landscape as they meander. So there are lots of bends and twists, and they move over time across left and right across the landscape. But of course we've built into the river, and that is what has built the City of London. And so the river's very much more constrained than what it would be naturally. It's a lot deeper, and because we've built sheer walls on either side of the water to keep the water over there and away from us and keep the land dry, not only has the depth increased, but the speed at which the tide runs is even faster. So here it's a bit wider. Obviously, if you go up into central London, that's where it's at its narrowest, and that is where the flow is deepest and fastest. So when a small baby fish, it's like maybe this big, is trying to get from the marshes in Essex and Kent all the way up to the freshwater parts of the Thames and into the rivers that drain into the Thames, they have to swim extremely fast, or they have to hunker down somewhere to ride out the ebb tide, the tide that's going back out to sea. So if you can imagine sheer walls, there's not really anywhere for wildlife to hang on to in the face of that speed of water and the volume of water. So what most fish tend to do is they'll hunker down in the edges of the river, right on the riverbed, and wait out an ebb tide as far as they can. It would be better if they had areas of habitat where they could get away from the main channel of the water. So when the estuary was in its natural state, they would have had that. There would have been what we call grades, off-river channels where it's quieter, the water flows slowly, where they could hide and wait out the tide, but they don't have that here anymore. And then what they'll do is essentially surf the tide. So they'll wait for the tide to start flooding back in, they'll release themselves off the bottom of the seabed, and they'll surf as far as they can until the tide changes again, and then they'll hunker down again. Not all fish can do that. We do have massive, what we call washouts of small baby fish every year, most years anyway. And the velocity of the water upstream in central London flows at twice the speed at which a baby fish can swim against. So you can imagine it's quite the gauntlet to run from one end to the other and back again. But a lot of species of fish in particular have to move between marine and freshwater conditions as part of their life cycle. It might be generally for breeding or for growing up into adults so that they can breed. So in the urban areas of London, what we tried to do over the last 20 years is essentially mimic how nature would have created these habitats naturally. So this is what an estuary edge site is. This is one of the first examples ever built in London, and it's actually one of the best as well. So this is over 20 years old. This was designed when the O2 Millennium Dome was being built, and the developer that owns this land, some of it's owned by the Greater London Authority, and some is owned by a developer called Night Dragon. Now, I'm not actually sure who the developer was when it was built, but basically the developer agreed with the Environment Agency to essentially give up some of the land. and they allowed 10 metres to be what we call given back to the sea. So this is what this is. It's a biomimicked, engineered reed bed, so it's all steel and rock underneath here. But how it's been designed is to mimic nature as far as possible. So you can't really see because of the reed beds have grown so lush and lovely over time. But underneath this, there's a sloping gradient of about 45 degrees. That's the optimal of what we want. And if you ever on the coast again and look at the natural succession of a salt marsh or coastal area, you'll see that there's a gradient, a natural sort of flow of where the water settles up to and where it settles down on a low tide. So we tried to mimic that as far as possible. And if you look, this is a very long reed bed, as you can see, and it's at different heights along the way. So that's trying to mimic the different types of intertidal and subtidal habitats that you would find naturally in a natural system. At the time, the developer wasn't really convinced. They thought, oh, okay, we'll give it a whirl. We'll see how well it works. And actually, this is anecdotal. Unfortunately, no one recorded it for prosperity. But the developer at the time said that it provided a 15% uplift in their property value from just having this reed bed alone. And the reason that that's important is because, as you can imagine, in a space like London, massively crowded, really built up, extremely historic, so there's a lot of areas that couldn't be given back to nature. It's these kinds of designs that we have to retrofit back into, try and build back into the way that our urban areas develop. The central section, there's not a lot we can do. There's heritage walls, there's the embankment that encloses the sewage system, no going back from that. So we have to have different interventions for rising sea levels, for the squeeze on wildlife and nature, and trying to find that balance with our safety, our property, and our economy. So in the central section, there's not a huge amount we can do. That's probably, we're going to have to raise the walls in some areas because of sea level rise. The water's going to get deeper. But with that comes opportunities to create better solutions on the landward side of the flood defence. So what I mean by that is these grassy areas that you can see up and down this pathway, these are aesthetic at the moment. These are aesthetic, that's the way they're built. They're sort of, they're just sort of grassy areas. But what could have been done is that we could have had solutions which we call sustainable urban drainage systems. Very dry technical term, but what that means is an engineered solution to give somewhere for the water to go instead of hard, grey, permeable surfaces. We need lots more green spaces, but engineered solutions underneath them to drain the water out and funnel it to either into the river cleaned or into some other system that we haven't got yet. But in the future, because we're going to suffer from drought, we're going to suffer from shorter periods but increased, much heavier bouts of rainfall. So these grey surfaces don't allow anywhere for the water to go. We've got to allow spaces for the water to drain either into an engineered solution or a natural into the soil and into the groundwater. Upstream, if you imagine, we're sitting in the bottom of a giant bowl, a big river basin. So all the rivers and the land drain into the tidal Thames, and that ultimately ends up in the global ocean after it's shuffled up and down over a 3-month period. But what's happening all over the Thames River Basin is they're trying to restore rivers upstream, reconnect them with their floodplains, giving some space for where the water can go naturally, and that's great for ecology and biodiversity. But we can't do that here in the tidal Thames because of the built-up nature of it. So in sections like this is where we have the space to create these kinds of intertidal terraces that biomimic a natural salt marsh. A couple of years ago, we updated a piece of guidance called Estuary Edges, Guidance for Developers, and that basically gives all the technical specs, the biological reasons for building these kinds of sites into any riverside development wherever possible. So this is the kind of solution we're trying to get in to the whole system of the Thames Estuary wherever we can. But reality is the main opportunities are all in East London. I mean, if you look over, we've got a lot of industry, we've got a lot of buildings going up all over the place, and if you got on a boat and went further downstream, you'd see on either side it's like a building site. It's like development is happening at an extremely quick pace all the way down the Thames corridor. London's getting much, much closer to Essex and Kent. So it's these kind of solutions that we need more and more of. Because what they do, they not only give a place for wildlife to forage, to take shelter from predators, which is how they would use a salt marsh naturally. So on a high tide, your smaller fish will come right in to the back of the terrace, right up against the wall. They'll forage around in the soil and in the base of the plants. And then as soon, like literally the millisecond that the tide turns, the fish are out of there. Because even in a natural system, they're frightened basically of getting stranded. So as soon as the tide turns, they're out into the main water. And if you're there when that happens, you can see that there's larger fish waiting on the edges of both a natural salt marsh system, but also in the intertidal terraces here. There's 17 such sites around London, 9 of which are actually on the tidal Thames. Some of them are up the tidal creeks of the rivers that drain into the Thames. And for the first time in 20 years, in 2017, we were asked to do a refresh of that piece of guidance that I mentioned and basically do a survey across all 17 sites. So how are they faring after 20 years in a heavy tidal environment? Structurally, are they sound? Is there any maintenance that needs doing? How much longer will they last without any future maintenance? How are they protecting the flood defence? Because don't forget, this is part of our flood defence. This vertical wall here at the back of the terrace, that is the flood wall. That's the sea defence wall, keeping the tide out. So how is that faring? Is it still fit for purpose? Anything to worry about there? No. But also, how are these sites being used by animals, by wildlife? All of what I've told you was just expert opinion up until about 4 years ago, when we did the first set of consistent ecological surveys. So we did fish surveys, we surveyed the flora of each of the sites, and we also took core samples of the sediment. Well, consultant did, we didn't, and took it back to a lab to have a look at what kind of invertebrates are in the sediment that the fish are feeding on, that the birds are feeding on that visit the site. So for the first time, we got what we call a baseline, a sort of a first look at how these sites are actually being used by wildlife, and found that we proved basically that they are using them like they would use a natural salt marsh, and that in itself has a hell of a lot of value, certainly for nature, but for increasingly for developers and corporate people who need to be able to show that they are working to enhance the environment at the same time as doing their business. This is actually law. So within 12 months, every single person, every developer who's building something along the riverside has to contribute what we're calling biodiversity net gain. It's another piece of jargon, but basically it means they have to leave the environment in a better state in which they found it. So solutions like this are exactly the kind of thing that they're expensive, they take time to design, but riverside development is at a premium. So all of that money can help to enhance and maintain the river for nature, but also it has a knock-on effect that really it should be tied to how their property is valued as well. At the moment, that's not the case. So all of the people making lots of money from these nice buildings, none of that money goes into the management or the maintenance of the river from which they derive their value. So an estuary edge site like this it has multiple benefits. That's how I would describe it. Great for nature, great for biodiversity. All those little fish, the eels that are trying to migrate up and down the river have somewhere to go, somewhere to shelter. It's really pretty to look at, and it sinks a lot of carbon. It helps with our flood defence, and it's great for birds as well, who have nowhere else to go across the Thames Estuary complex. So it's also providing a stepping stone. So instead of having to go from the marshes in Essex and Kent through nothing, well, not nothing, but the water column, with nowhere to go until they get up into the rivers, we're providing we call them a string of pearls of habitat. So that's what we need more of, more connectivity between the lower marshes in the ocean, through the tidal Thames, wherever possible, up into the freshwater reaches where the floodplain is more restored in the Arcadian Thames, for example. And that just gives the fish nice places to go on their journey, their gauntlet that they have to run up and down the tidal Thames.
Welcome back. Isn't that incredible that the fish know that split second the tide changes? It's pretty special that we even know that at all. Next we have another Vox Pop where we ask the question, how do you feel when you're by the Thames?
Relaxed.
Overwhelmed.
Impressed.
Happy.
Passionate.
Calm.
Well, how did you find that? I thought that was just so lovely. Next we go back to Wanda, where we hear all about the geology of the river basin. I hope you enjoy listening.
The geology of the Thames river basin is that it's clay, silt and chalk. And that's what gets washed down with the river, with the tributaries, and that's why we have the muddy silt and clay muddy River Thames, which gives the color of the river. So it's not because it's dirty. That's the natural color of it. It would have been the same color when the Romans arrived. In fact, they called it Thamesis, which means dark. And you can see here you can really well see how the mud is sort of accumulating on the riverbed, and it's a really nice habitat for invertebrates. Then that we are bringing the lovely birds. There's a couple of cormorants there, seagulls, etc. So it's a really nice habitat. So
Another estuary edge.
and that's another estuary edge over there, yes?
Did it change during the lockdown, the river colour?
That's a really good question. I actually saw it on Twitter because I was in lockdown. Saw it on Twitter that there was much more algae that was accumulating on the riverbed, which was more exposed during the low tide, and that's actually a really nice food for birds, because the geese, etc., that's what they will really feed on. And that was quite striking for some of the people, especially those who work close to the Thames, that in fact that would be the natural process, but because of the wave and the wash, etc., that gets taken away. And the other thing is that you can see, this is a really nice display, I think, because you can see some of the things that you could find within the foreshore or within the mud, the salt marsh. Salt marshes are much more further towards the outer part, and also the reed bed. So the natural environment would have been reed bed, salt marsh, and the exposed foreshore, really. But the reed bed is obviously being mimicked by the estuary edges, and the salt marsh is more towards the outer estuary. And if you come to the other side, so there's a bit around the flood defense as well, how the flood being stopped, really. You can see how the river level was also changing. But what's quite striking is that you can see here, that map over there, and I'm not really sure how accurate is that, but if there would have been any flood defense, that would be the area that would get inundated. So we are already in the process of having all these structures in are very important, because otherwise London would get regularly flooded.
Welcome back. We now have our last Vox Pop for you, and it's a little different to the last two. We ask 3 of our guests what their favourite memory is by the River Thames. And who knows, maybe you'll share a favourite memory with them. Let's find out.
Maybe watching the fireworks at New Year, because that's always along the river, isn't it? But then there's, picnics by the river in the summer, or being brought down to the Thames barrier when I was a kid just to see it, because it was new and my dad thought we should go and have a look. I just moved here last week, literally, and I did rowing coaching back in the Netherlands, where I'm from. And last week I started rowing again, technically on a side channel of the Thames, which is in the Royal Docks next to London City Airport. And I was coaching again for the first time since the pandemic, really. And that was really fun and really nice to be back at the water, and good feeling.
I don't know if I have a sort of favourite memory as such. I sort of live relatively close to the river, so I go for a run every now and again. not a very long one, but it's just quite nice to sort of pause, and that's almost like a little reward, sort of just watching the river. Yeah.
Wasn't that lovely? I'd love to find out your favourite memory by the river. Have you got one that's sprung to mind? You'll have to let me know for our Twitter. I feel like I have so many nice memories by the Thames. It is difficult to pick one. I think for me there's points when I was a teenager that really resonate with me. Running around South Bank was very fun, and when I went to college I used to walk up and down Wandsworth Bridge, and there was a point where in the evenings during the sunset you would have so many starlings dancing around the bridge. It was absolutely gorgeous. I did actually find a video that someone posted of this memory that I've got, which I will put in the show notes if anybody is interested. It's just so special. Now, moving on to our last segment of the show, we have Amy and Wanda talking to us about the foreshore of the river. And at this point of the walk, we're stood on the foreshore opposite Canary Wharf, and it is quite the view. I hope you enjoy listening.
The only other thing to say here is the foreshore is not a maintained environment, so please do be careful when you're walking around. But it is, especially a place like this, it is an absolute cornucopia for wildlife. If you're lucky, if you find a big flat stone and you just lift it up, chances are you'll find a small eel living underneath it, waiting, well, not living underneath it, but waiting for the tide to come back in. So it's found a nice dark, dank, wet place to just wait out the low tide until the high tide comes back in. So if you want to have a wander around, there's all sorts of archaeological finds here as well. The other thing to say about the foreshore is this is man-made. This isn't natural. This was made in the 1800s. And all of the foreshore was designed for flat-bottomed Thames barges to be able to rest on the foreshore at a low tide. And that's what we still have today, basically. But because of the dynamic nature of the river, it lifts the sediment up into the water on a flood tide, and it moves that sediment around naturally. That's what an estuary would do, exacerbated slightly by the constrainedness of the area. But basically, this is what our archaeological friend Fiona Hockey calls the largest self-excavating archaeological trench in the world. And what that means is, on any given day, she can go down on a low tide, she'll be in the Middle Ages, she'll find lots of stuff from the Middle Ages, she'll have to go back off the foreshore on a high tide, come back on the next low tide, and suddenly she's in Roman times, because the river scours the foreshore and it scours the seabed and uncovers things on every single tide. So if you know what you're looking for, it's a fascinating place to go mudlarking, but I haven't quite got my eye in, even after all these years. So we rely on people like Fiona to join us occasionally on walks and talks and tell us about what we can see. But basically, if you're trying to see anything that doesn't look like a natural shape, so like perfectly round things, very, very shiny things, very colourful things or linear things, chances are it could be a clay pipe, it could be a bit of pottery, it could be a coin, but also watch out for litter and sharps. So yeah, just be careful if you're going to touch anything, and if you do touch anything, use hand sanitizer afterwards.
Okay. And just to add to this, so we talked about the mud and the importance of the mud and how the River Thames is muddy. So that's also the greatest assets of it when it comes to finding these archaeological items, because mud doesn't hold any oxygen. So if there's no oxygen, no bacteria, nothing will degrade. And this is why we keep on finding, or people keep on finding items from the past, going back to Roman times or even from before. Because as the water moves, it's just again, it's just resuspended and redeposited onto the foreshore, and because it's muddy, it doesn't degrade.
You have now reached the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed your guided walk and learnt some fun facts along the way. Maybe ask a friend or a relative what their favourite memory is by the River Thames. It could open up some fun memories. As always, a big thank you for joining us today. It's been great to have you. This episode is being brought to you by me, Chloe Russell, on behalf of the Thames Estuary Partnership, and I look forward to welcoming you next time.